Hey everyone, how you guys
What's
doing
up,
tonight?
Jeff?
Hello.
So this week we start React, but before we do that, I kind of want to go through sort of like what an actual API request should look like post-wise, code-wise. I know we kind of started that with week 6. We're going to continue that with the React stuff. Not this week. I think it becomes week 3 or 4 where we dive in with fetch. But one of the kind of things I know with people using CrudCrud or using some of the other APIs that were out there, you'd run into like a host of different issues that typically don't happen with API calls for most, like, I'd say professional software that's out there or things of that nature. So let me go ahead and share my screen here. All right, so what this is this is an API for a essentially a DevOps system we use that's tied to Microsoft Azure at work. We've kind of been developing some tools that allow us to just go to the API from other software programs and add stuff to our DevOps program. This to give you sort of this idea of what DevOps is. It is essentially kind of a Kanban sort of agile approach to software development. And this is what we use to manage projects through the city of South Bend and, manage our repos, manage who's assigned what, manage pipelines, which are essentially, versions of application releases. And when we make changes in Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code, they go through a pipeline from a dev server to a production server out to push for web apps, things like that. We don't really use test plans or artifacts too much, but this is just giving you this idea of what this is. So if we look at the API for a work item, and what a work item is, I'll just go to some of mine here. They're kind of different, but so like here's one where that's in testing right now. So I built an app that does some at least JavaScript visualization of yard waste pickups that our solid waste department does. So this is a work item. It's a task. So when we look at this API here, we can make a post to this particular API, and you'll see it says organization and the project. So for instance, this one, the organization for us is South Bend IN, and then this is that project in this particular application. So I'm going to actually copy that, and we go back and we can kind of see like what's some of the from the documentation, like what needs to go in. So we can just make this with this particular HTTP call here, just post to this particular API, as long as we tell it what to do, test. So let's go ahead and go over to Visual Studio. And let me actually put up a directory here. All right, so just kind of a blank directory. create just a app.js, and then just a basic HTML file so we can see what it's returned. One of the things that, like I said, we're going to move away from the AJAX calls to towards fetch. So I'll show you sort of the setup of what that fetch request looks like. So let me grab a token real quickly that I created for this. And most APIs, again, are going to have some sort of token that you have to use or some sort of, basic idea that, or ID that lets the app know it's you. This is, you're authorized to do this. This is one that I just created generically for this assignment or for this particular class, just to show like, hey, this is what a token will do. Now this token, you can set them, like if you do a Google API and you set up a dev key or token, they'll expire based on what Google wants. We can set for this particular system, like I have this token expiring in 24 hours. So 24 hours from now, if I were to try to use it, it's expired. But we can do them unexpiring, a month, 3 months, so on and so forth. So when we kind of look at fetch and we go to some of the other APIs that are out there, we'll see that you can get to these API keys or developer keys that will let that API know who you are. And the reason being is, so when we get back to, like if we make this particular call here, so let me grab the cities, copy that, to here. And then we said, just kind of do this with a fetch call. So with a fetch call, the first thing you pass in is a URL that you're actually going to make the call to. So that's part of a URL, and I need to go grab the rest of it. And so here, I think I need to add in is the tag, the type. So just make it a task. Let's make sure I got it. So we're fetching a type of, or we're putting in a post, and then what we pass in for the second value for a fetch is our parameters that we want to use. So in this case, a method, we do a post, and then for the headers, I at least have to pass in this token, so that way essentially it knows it's me. And then this particular system has some quirks as far as what you have to pass in for the content type. And the content type is like what you'll see is this thing called, what's the file going to be? In our case, it's going to be a JSON patch plus file. So here, if I pass this in, and I don't put any other parameters in, but typically for a post, you're going to want to put a body in. So if we were to go down here and just grab that sample, body, let's do this one here. And then this. Let's pass it in like that. And then what you do, what a fetch does is what basically every API call, even the Ajax version, is it returns essentially the fetch returns a promise. So you're going to basically have to kind of handle the promise. So in this particular thing, we'll just console log out the response that comes back from the system. And so let's save that. Go over here. And we're going to open with live server. And then we see nothing there. So let's go over to the console. So it didn't like it. So give me a 400. And the particular reason is it probably didn't like how I put in the JSON. So let me go back to here. This. This is the one thing I definitely would want to mention is that when it comes to APIs, a lot of times you really do have to play around with how things get passed into them. So that's why it's kind of really, I know one of the big hangups was with the house API. The second requirement for that API for the area, it was on the API side of things. It was requiring an integer field. So, if you're trying to pass in anything that wasn't just a pure integer, it was giving you problems for that. Because on the backend side of that, what gets tossed into either some sort of like on the fly database or, some sort of, actual database, you would see that it's a backend or that the backend part of the database, that's what needs to go in there. So,
yeah, I only spent like 30 minutes with the API and then I moved on to just making all arrays.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, that's kind of the thing about those is it's just, yeah, and I will tell you, I'll talk to a little bit more about this as we get closer to it, but I've been working with Tyler today about trying to come up with, an API that we have a bit more control over for the final React project. So then that way, like, I can be your documentation. So if people are having problems with it, I can actually see it on the back end. We just need to figure out how we want to build it and test it out, but we have a few weeks to do that. But so as you can see from my screen here, it was successful. It just didn't like the way I was putting the JSON in. But what it returns is a readable stream, my headers, or here's the response. And so if we go look at the JSON or the text, we get the status was okay, type URL. So it created that here. So let me log out the JSON so we can see specifically what that looks like. So over here, and we'll chain another then. And so we'll see data. So you know what? Let's do it here. So we'll grab the JSON. And we'll chain a then. take a look at the data that comes from that. And then we'll log that out and see what we get from there. All right, so this gives us, this is what's returned. So here we get the URL to the work item that was created. This is a bunch of stuff that's geared specifically to the Azure DevOps system. So as you can see, things like, you know, there's a status, there's system state of to do. So if we were to grab this URL, yeah, let's see, we go to look at here. Hope that didn't do that. There. Probably a little bit more than I needed. See, 658. So if I look at this in our actual DevOps app, so this is what we created. And as you can see, the state is set to do. And if we look at this, it's set to do as well. So this is basically, you know, what gets returned from like a post in an API where you're actually like, you know, getting some valid info returned from the system. And now what you can do when you do these APIs and you get this information is you can add this to a website, or you can add this to, you know, basically we can now take some of this stuff, make changes to it, and it'll create something like this, but with our changes as well. So I just wanted to show you that, like, when you're actually doing like API work, you know, it's normally going to be a lot easier. Most of the time, you're really playing around with things like the fetch statement and post statement, or not the post, but the body, trying to pass in the right parameters and find out exactly, you know, what the parameters are. Again, this is nice because, you know, it's Microsoft and there's this whole, you know, entire wiki on documentation just related to their API for DevOps. So that's kind of one of the things I saw people running into, was because of the DevOps issue, or no, I'm sorry, because of the API issue and not knowing exactly what was going to get passed through. It's a little bit more difficult to kind of see like, oh, okay, this is why this isn't working. So, you know, to kind of show you the back end of a API, and like I said, all the people that have done the backend course will kind of recognize this stuff here, is that you can create the backend in like several programming languages. Obviously, Promineo Tech would do it in Java with the Spring Boot library. But so what happens when you're looking at the backside of a, this wasn't one, but the backside of a API call is you're going to be looking at this one works. This is a separate one I built. You're going to be looking at Java tied to some sort of database for us. So this one, this steps up my connection. So if you were to look at when you're calling your endpoints, these are going into some sort of program that looks like this, And basically it's, if you were to call an endpoint on this one, if I were to upload it to a server, I'd have some website address and then an endpoint to submit form or save form. And so now that gets pushed through to essentially a class or an object that's expecting a certain level or certain types of data to be into this. So if we were to look at this one, this is expecting mostly strings, but the ID, which is generated by the database or by Spring Boot, would be a type of long, which is a numeric character or numeric set of numeric characters. But so if you were to put in something that wasn't a string in the form itself, then it's going to throw an error at you or it's not going to work. So that's kind of what's happening when you're seeing, like with that house one, if you were trying to use data that wasn't the type that it was expecting to see, then it would throw some type of error at you. And that's one of those errors that I saw a few of you guys having. So part of the reason why I kind of approached some people or some of the people at the school about building out a couple simple APIs like this, just so then that way I could tell you guys specifically, this field is you'd be looking at a string for this or a number for this, and I could specifically help you guys kind of navigate the back end side of it when you guys are doing the front end. The other issue that a lot of people had was what's called a CORS issue. And essentially CORS is, it's not anything wrong with your app other than you're not sending the right communication to what the web or the API is looking for to say, yes, you're allowed to kind of write back and forth to my local host here. So you have to kind of like get around that a little bit. One way is that live server, but when that's not working, and I saw one of the instructors posted something and I chatted with him, that CRUD sort of misinterprets almost like 90% of its errors as some sort of CORS issue. But the CORS thing is just a sort of a protection for your browsers placing on you in your system to say, hey, we're not sure if you really want to do this or not. You really want to pull information from this API. So you can disable CORS. We have that done in a very lockdown manner on some of my work stuff. And literally all I do is local stuff where I'm pulling in an app in almost a container type setting. So that means it can't really access anything else on my system. But normally you don't want to do that. There's enough ways around it. And we're going to talk about some of those with the fetch method when we get into that with some of the headers and some of the things you pass through the fetch method to send to the API call. So you guys weren't alone if you were like banging your head against the wall with the API calls. Most APIs kind of stink initially until you get them figured out. That's just the norm with API work because you're trying to talk to another system that you didn't build unless you built the API, which, heads up to some of my Java people that might want to use one of their Spring Boot APIs that they built. That's a real possibility we can look at for your final project. That way you know exactly what it was you built. So plus it kind of gives you that cool full stack app to show off too. But if that's not what you're interested in, or if you don't have that, like I said, I'm gonna be working. We did like a little research, Tyler and I did, on the idea of building out an API that's built in Node and uses a Mongo database. So we might be able to build up something pretty quickly and test out and be able to have you guys use if you want to for once the project starts in week 4. Any questions about APIs and just some of the issues you guys are having with those, or any just kind of questions in general about them?
Just one recommendation for anybody that was still struggling with last week's assignment. If you're running into like the CRUD, the CORS issue with when you're doing it, the easiest way I found to get around it was just go into CRUD, open it up in like an incognito browser and just get a new URL from them and then enter it in. Because I kept bumping into the 100 refresh limits. Because anytime I would update anything at all, it would tick down. So I must have gone through 4 or 5 URLs just with them alone, just trying to test things.
Yeah, that was the other kind of issue with the CRUD is, you know, and I think we ran into this with when I was working with Jaden, and we just sort of, you know, played around with one, but it was an expired one, so I had to go into a Firefox, open a Firefox browser to sort of mimic that I'm a new user to grab a new API call. Yeah, so that's kind of that one sort of drawback to CRUD. It's probably worth paying the $2 just so you don't get more time and refreshes with it.
I'm surprised the
so-
school doesn't have an API built out for.
Well,
Like,
that's what I'm trying to do for you guys, is give you guys one and have you guys be able to have one or two to use from and choose and play around with. And like I said, the students that did the back end, if you want, you know, like I said, we can work through on how to publish those and how to actually assign the endpoints to them so you can use them for your project too. But for everybody else, I'm working with Tyler to build out these to make it so that you can connect to a good API, a solid API, and be able to do all the CRUD operations without limitations as far as, you know, 100 refresh limits or things like that. So we don't have to really worry about that till week 4. Right now, you guys can sort of put APIs in the background as we go to the React side of things. So before we kind of go too far into this, I think the one question I had when I first started looking at React is like, why would I do this? Why would I need this other than somebody telling me to build something in React? And there's plenty of long answers, but there's some, you know, really good like short answers too. One of the things I found is that it's really good when you're passing like data that's refreshing quite a bit, and you need to pass that into your UI without doing constant page refreshes. And you're going to have different things in what they call state. So like whether it's, you know, potential, like one of the things we built recently is a you know, sort of like a mapping program for some of our code enforcement people, and we use React and mixed in with a few other different programs we're pulling data from. But it's great because we have components that are just assigned to like render certain things, and all we have to do is just pass data through those different components and not have to refresh everything. And we could change the state of those components depending on whether or not, you know, the person out in the field clicks on a certain button, does a, you know, writes a certain note, or, you know, is it has to reassert, you know, reschedule the you know, the I guess the inspection or whatnot. So we have to do a lot of things like that. So it's kind of nice to be able to, you know, sort of build out the components and then pass this data through them, but then change what if, for instance, like somebody's looking at they're at the house, they're looking at they're pull up the spot detail. It's got a picture of the potential complaint or the house. It's got a list of what the complaint is or what the inspection needs to be happening. And, you know, the code enforcement officer can click on different things, and that changes, you know, each component's behavior to then do something else, or to essentially send messages back to the database system to say, hey, change this to this. So if you're building out like a portfolio site, is React a great idea? No, unless you really want to get some practice to build React apps, then I would recommend it. But if you're going to be doing anything, like think about like a stock app, like where you're, let's just say you're doing like, I don't know, you're into like environmentally friendly stocks. So you're doing blogs on like different, stocks, and maybe one of your blogs, you've got a tie into a ticker that's updating from like an API from like, New York Stock Exchange or NASDAQ or something like that. And that ticker is refreshing all the time. Well, you don't want to refresh that page to do that all the time. So React allows you to make that component for that ticker for you to be able to pull that data in and just sort of give that component different states. So, it's kind of really like changes sort of like the UI of how you'll present sort of ongoing or ever changing data to websites. So when you think of like, a booking site like Orbitz or, Travelocity or something, a lot of they might not necessarily use React, they might be using Angular or, Vue or something along those lines. But the idea is these component-based frameworks, and in React's case, library, allows the more control over of like this button is pressed, so what's the state of this button, and how does that state of that button impact the rest of the the user experience. So it's kind of neat in that effect. You won't see it necessarily in week one. Like I said, when I reviewed the materials and did the code along, and I put that up in the the chat for our cohort. Yeah, you're probably going to think, why am I doing it this way when I could just make the HTML and just like put stuff in there? Well, because the idea is that eventually becomes like we had things like React routers, which connect us to different APIs and then pull those data in and then render that data using these components. So it does get more meaningful. We're just kind of like sort of starting at the very, very beginning. So just kind of remember that like the idea here is to be that first building block to what will become a pretty neat tool in your tool belt for job. If you're at a job, you're going to probably run into React if you're doing any sort of front end work. Or if you do some freelance stuff, you might find that you take on a bigger project and you use React for certain components to interact with, like maybe a chat component or some sort of like form level component where you don't want to switch out the entire, it's a long form and you just want somebody to be able to like, they click the next button for the next page of the form, and all you want to do is change the state and now display a different part of the form. React is really kind of useful for those sorts of things. So I do have a couple articles I'm going to put out there that I think do a pretty neat job of explaining, when to use React and when to kind of look at other tools. So I definitely think there's a very strong push towards a lot of React type apps or React apps in general. So it's definitely a good tool to know and how to know to recognize. But the ultimate thing to kind of remember is it's just a tool. Just like any other tool, there are right tools and wrong tools for the job. And sometimes React will be the wrong tool, but other times it'll be the perfect tool for the job. It is the kind of sort of the the hotness out there, if you will, for the front end developer job market. It's kind of pushing Angular, and I was going to say not as much Vue. Vue sort of has its different uses, but Angular has kind of gotten pushed more and more towards the back burner. That was Google's framework for JavaScript. This is React is Facebook's brainchild, so to speak, and now it is more obviously very public and very much used as a great backend or a great support community. And in fact, if you look at So let me just kind of fire up this. Let's see, let's start up here. So once my local host starts up, okay, so if you go to that, when you use like the basic create React app, it'll give you this link to the essentially the documentations and tutorials for React. And these are, again, they're kind of like on par with Bootstraps. They're really good to try to do some specific, tutorial type things. They have a nice walk you through kind of step-by-step tutorial. And then their documentation is really, very good. They have different components you can download to CodePen, which is nice. They have a very active blog. In fact, there's actually a React conference coming up that I'm going to send you guys a link to. I think by the time it happens, you guys might be close to done or be almost finished. It's a virtual conference, so it's kind of cool to see what different people are talking about in terms of like new kind of the newer stuff with React. But yeah, the react.js.org site is a really great tool for getting more and more stuff about React, diving deeper into it. They even list like free courses, paid courses, so definitely recommend everybody kind of go check out this page here, which, like I said, it comes when you're looking at the React app starting from local host, you can get to it, or it's the react.js.org. So with that, has everybody pretty much watched the videos, or at least kind of seen some of the videos?
Not at all.
You what, Renee?
Not at all.
Okay. All right. So no problem. But what I want to do is I kind of want to skip some of the, I don't really want to go through like the Webpack stuff, since you can use the Create React app and that does everything for you. In fact, I've already got one started. Let me go ahead and shut this down and then open this up in Visual Studio Code. I have the one, like I said, the code along. I put that out there to everybody. So, I have one that is already sort of ready to go here. It's got the Create React app installed. And now what do I mean by that, Create React app? So if you haven't watched the videos, essentially there are two ways to sort of start out on a React app. So let me back up here and do a so let's go into this NPM Expo. So in here, I have nothing there yet. So one of the things that you can do is with any file, we can do an npm init, do the npm install of the Webpack and everything like that. But there's also kind of this shortcut that is talked about in the, I think it might be the third video, but it's npm create react app, and then we name it, just call it test creation. And so what this does is it creates all the components necessary to have a React app started, like to get that little page that I was showing you guys before. It does take a while. So this is nothing, this is all created with the Create React app. So if we wanted to go in and look at, there's the index.html file, and this is actually rendering nothing itself. In fact, if you didn't have JavaScript turned on, it would give you this message that you need to have JavaScript enabled, because everything is coming from the React components. So in here is kind of our first dive in when you're looking at the Create React app, that you see the various components or references to some of the JSX that we're going to be diving into a little bit more. So let me check to see if we created. It does take a while. That is the one thing to kind of note about the Create React app. But this one right here was built with the Create React app. So, you know, as you can see, it looks a lot like JavaScript and HTML kind of mixed together. So when you look at like this div tag, it looks like a normal HTML div tag, but however, you're referencing class name the way you would in JavaScript. So that's kind of one of those sort of slight changes, and that reminder that JSX is just, you know, sort of it's a framework or library of JavaScript. And you know, what you're doing is you're typically going to be passing in like the JavaScript type versions of these attributes to your React app components so that it knows how to render them. So go back here real quickly. It's still building. And keep checking back on that. But this one, like I said, was built with that. So with this, you know, we're looking at this main file, app.js. And so what would happen here is if we had, once this is done running, I can do the live server and we can start making changes and see how these changes will impact things. But just to kind of go through a few different things here with this React app, and if we look at our index.js, so index.js is where we're importing basically everything in and then passing it into the HTML document. Right here, we're getting that element by ID. This is familiar. You guys have seen this. You guys have used this. You know this well. So we're grabbing this root element from index.html, which, as you can see in the body, it's the only element there that would actually appear on anything on the screen. It's that div id.root. So index.js for the Create React app loads up all your imports that you need to get started, and then you know, basically renders essentially the app, and then the document, and then it basically tells it where to render to. So in this particular case, we're rendering, you know, we're calling that app class, and we're rendering this get element by ID. We're rendering it to that element by ID root. So if we were, if we were to say, change this to you know, put a P in there, for instance, and then I'll just give it an ID of somewhere different. And then we go back over to this index.js, and then we change that to somewhere different. This will have no impact on our app. Let me open up another command prompt here. All right, so here we're just gonna start up our React app, and it's gonna basically create a local host type server for us. So as soon as that loads up, we'll be able to kind of make a few changes and see some of those changes in play here. So we have our React app up and running. And so, like I said, let's just go back in and make a couple changes. So like for here, I did this where I grabbed the ID of somewhere different. So let's do this too. Let's go ahead and go to our app.js. And then let's do this and just say, we changed this. And then reload. It's actually doing it for us, which is nice. Get it open to too many locals. Eventually, does take a bit time. Okay, so as you can see, here's that part we changed. And again, when you think about React, think about it in terms of components and objects and classes, things like that. So the app itself is a component we're bringing into the main file to render it. And we're, as you can see, I changed where this is getting rendered to, and it did not cause us any problems. So yeah, I gave it a whole new thing. So you can make changes within the HTML as well as, but you can do everything outside of that. So, you know, if we really just wanted to kind of keep this to root, so like if I take that, it's not going to know where to look for this. So it just gives us this blank screen. But if we go in and we tell index, oh yeah, we want this to be rendered to the div that contains the ID root, and we're back to that. So any questions about just setting up the initial create React app? And now it is done. All right. So yeah, that's basically it right there. It is simple as going into the directory you want to be in, making sure that you have, npm installed either globally or within a directory, and then you typing in the command npx create-react-app, and then a space, and then what you want the app to be called. In our case, I used test creation. So if we look at the directory in here, we'll see that there is a new directory called test creation. So I'll cd into that. And then there are my node modules, my JSON or my package JSON, my public folder, my SRC folder. So that creates all of this stuff that we were able to see here to get started on everything. So when you look at kind of the material that was presented, there were kind of the first way to sort of do things without the JSX, and then the JSX way, which is what the Create React app builds them out in JSX. So let's do a, let's create a new file in here. And we'll just call it, I'm going to test it. Just call it test UI.js. So the first thing we have to do when we're creating any sort of component is we have to make sure we, are importing, in this particular instance, if we want to import it into here, we can do that. So let's go ahead and make sure that it's out there for our UI from, and on the same level. So it'll be period JS. And as you can see, we declared, but it's never read. So just like here, we wanted to do test UI and close it out. That now has that rendered or ready to be rendered. But we haven't putting in anything in there. So we have on this particular thing, we have the import React set, and then we have also our React DOM that's already created. But because we're going to be using that component, I'm going to import React here as well. Probably don't need it, but I'd rather just have it to be on the safe side. In fact, they probably say it's declared, values never used, but we will be using it to do our export in this particular case. So just call this test class, and we're going to extend the React component. So React component class. Then we need our render. We grab it from here. And, oh no, I don't think we had it. Yeah, that's right, because we get rid of it from the, oh, there it is. Okay. So we'll just grab this, save us a little time. And then we'll go back over to here. So here we have the JSX, but what we want to do is we actually want to use the React component. So if we're going to do this, we're going to basically have to call a create element or something along those lines. So what we're going to do is return that. But instead of like, if you remember from JavaScript, this document, create element, And the document referred to the DOM, if you kind of remember our class from a couple weeks ago. So, but since React's creating this sort of like virtual DOM, so to speak, we're going to be creating this element on the React DOM. So here, we're just going to use that same create element, but we're using it for React's purposes. And this takes in basically 3 requirements. The first is what element are we creating? So let's just say in this case, we'll create a P element. The next thing would be, what do we want to pass in? What are the properties? And you'll start to hear them be called props. Props become a bigger thing in React too, because it deals with state changing and things like that. But for this first week, we're going to just kind of pass in like a class just to say, oh, okay, this is recognizable. Or we can even just do like attributes like style. And then we'll do, let's say, background, color, actually, the background color, red. Screen object, that's right. So it's there. And then what do we want this to say? So just put in some text. This was made with React. And here, just do a class. We'll name it PG color. We'll pass that in, or I'll make a quick one. So this right here is essentially all you need to create a React class or a React element using the React component. So you don't need this or this. You can have this set to null, and this can be empty as well. But we're going to add some things to it, so that way we just have a little bit more in there. So we'll just pass this into our main CSS, and then let's do just do it to the app. P and color. And so from here, we have an element that we can now import into our main JavaScript index.js. So what's going to be rendered is this first app, which gives us this all this fun stuff here. So let's kind of get rid of this because I don't really care if it's in strict mode or not. And we'll just keep the test UI. Save that. Go back over to our app. Oh, problem. So it didn't like that I got rid of test UI. Oh, and typos in programming. So this is really what we want to bring in. And then values never used. And we do want to use that here. You're going to be bringing that render and then SQI. Still is telling me it doesn't like it. Oh, because I copied that error, that's why. There we go. I should fix that. Yeah, well, maybe. So we're going to return that. And then we want to pass that in. See what sort of, so it gives us. So it doesn't like. Oh. Sorry, one of those React requirements that I forgot to take care of. So if we do, rename this to capital T. And then here, let's make sure we change this. Yep, so we're going to do that. So that'll hit our imports. And then here, let's change this. There we go. Now it's seeing it. So let's go back to this. And there we have our React component. So here, as you can see, this is that component we made. If we look at the element, we have, this is now in there. So we have this as part of our React DOM. So this is using those component or the create element with the React component. And what this does, like I said, is it just allows you to create elements on the fly. But again, now with JSX, we can just do something as simple as just if I take this out, and then just make this simply a paragraph and add that class. And that will be equal to PG color. And then here, just put in, was made using JSX. And I can get rid of all this other stuff. And then we'll just put our closing tag out there. So now, we save that, go back to our React app, we could see that it changed that. Blow that up a little bit for everybody. So it went from this was made using React to this was made using JSX because we changed those components, or we changed what was being passed in to that component. So if we go back to and look at our default class that's being extended, we can see that we have it looks again sort of like HTML with a little bit of mix of JavaScript. And again, I think the biggest question, at least I know I asked when I was learning React, is this better get better than this? It does. And like I said, the cool thing is that especially once you start tying it in with like some bootstrap type elements, things like that, you'll be passing in things that are returned from like your database or your API in here using components like the card component from Bootstrap. And so we'll be able to update things much easier by just essentially making, hitting a submit button. It'll change the state of what that React component looks like. And then it'll potentially build out new or render new React components to the React DOM. So this is really kind of all there is to the basic JSX concept. The only other thing, and as he mentions in the video, if you are passing in a couple of different lines, like if we go and look back at the video code, newsfeed had, yeah. So if there's a couple here that you're going to return, you need the parentheses there. So if we're going to do something like that, we want to pass in, let's just say, a couple of paragraphs. We can do the last name, and I'll do PG color, and we'll change that. And so, oh yeah, so parent element we need here. So we'll do the div here, and then we can copy these into there. So now basically what we get passed in is this empty div, 2 paragraphs, and then let me just go ahead and make this div PG color and the CSS. So I'll do, this one was PG color, and then we'll copy this. And I'll just change it to black so it stands out in the sense from the red. We'll keep the font the same. It's all saved, it's updated, and there are our React components being passed in. And as you can see, made using JSX, and the second one was made, using JSX as well. So what's happening here is that we are creating these elements within that render, within that test UI class that we're now passing through to this index.js. Now we still have that app class available. So if we want to bring that in and render that, then we'll give this a parent element. So we'll just do another empty div and pass these in for a div here. So this should pass in that app, and then everything tied to app, which is just that default, basically that render thing that we first saw with like the logo and stuff. If we go back through and we see this, we see, okay, here's the first thing being passed through, which is the app that's tied to this div, and then the div tied to these 2 paragraphs down here is what's being passed in. So if we go back through and let's just say, let's make this another quick class here. So let's go right here. I'll just call it class 2. Okay, so I'm gonna copy some of this stuff from here. Here. Here we want to make sure we're passing out class 2. So we want to export it as a component. But for this part, we'll do what right here. We can do the E, and what he did equals React create element, and then within that, so if we look at that, we would then pass in. So we could pass in the different parameters of that. So we have return, and then what we're going to do here is we're going to basically say, okay, we want to pass in the type of element. So we're going to do, let's do a button. And here we'll leave the props blank. And then we'll just do text that's just a sample button. We are going to render that straight there. So actually, let me get this out here. Okay, and then from here, we want to go back to where we're getting our main info. We want to make sure we're importing that class. So we're going to be importing class 2, and then from class 2. So it goes ahead and fills a lot of it out for you. So instead of app, I'm going to test UI first, and then we'll go ahead and bring in class 2, close that out, and then we'll render that and see, we'll run that. And so as you can see now, we still have what was brought in from test UI, and then what was brought in from the class 2 button. So that's showing us the sample button. And then we can see our diffs for these parts here. Any questions about what I've kind of gone over so far? Okay.
If you change something, you have to be careful, right?
With what?
Like if you go to change something, you have to be very careful because it's tied to like 3 other pages.
Yeah. Well, sort of. I mean, like if I go in here and let's just say, if I come in something here and just say I leave that off, for instance, and there's some sort of typo, and then we go back, it tells you where the problem was. So the React error messages are actually pretty nice because it points to like where it had the problem. And I mean, it's not, not like the best error messages, but they're still a lot better than like some of the sort of cryptic like error messages that you'd see in like Java or Python or things like that. But at least points it where you're supposed to be. So it tells you where the error comes from. So you can go back through and go in there, say, okay, maybe that's where that error was, fix it. But yeah, if you're passing in, like, let's say test UI is, I have, let's copy it. We have it in there 4 times. So one of the nice things about not having to rebuild components is that, you can just sit there simply and put that test UI in there 4 times. Now, however, if you, like you said, Isaiah, if you make a change and you're just kind of like, wait, what happened? Let's say now it's kind of like, oh crap, this one little change messed up, the whole, sort of lay of the web page there. So that is one of the downsides to it. It's you get that sort of nice feel of being able to work with components and reuse components over and over again, and be able to change state of certain components. And that's where the props come in. So that we'll be sort of dealing with in the next week. I believe we do. And then, the week after, we start getting into that a little bit more deeper about changing the state regarding components and state through props and how we render that different state. So this will be, this is the very like elementary building blocks of React. This is kind of just getting used to seeing how React looks at elements and how it puts them into the page that you're looking at and sort of renders its own React DOM, if you will. But yeah, so if we go back to that and we, go ahead and add that back in, now we can see it has updated all the components accordingly. Any other questions about that? All right, so let's go and look at the coding assignment just to make sure everybody's good on where they need to be for that. Again, you'll definitely want to git ignore. I think I posted one in the file before or in the Slack channel, but I'll do another one, or I'll cut and paste one for React as well. So with the homework for this week, you're going to essentially use components and build out components. I would recommend using some of the the JSX, and then also maybe some of the React the create element too, just to use both of them. You'll go more towards JSX moving in the future, and then if you're building out your own React apps, you'll see that that JSX is very helpful for that standpoint. But yeah, so from here, you'll be just essentially building out just a small, simple project like the newsfeed project. So not a whole lot to sort of dive into. You can do, you can use Bootstrap if you want to kind of use their navbar classes and things like that. He does that in the video, and I do have that code for some of the buttons and things like that to show you how you just bring those classes in. But it's no big deal. You just make sure you have your calling or you have the node modules for Bootstrap installed on the main index.html page. So when we're here, we're looking at like the newsfeed one on the main page. So there are oh yeah, I think I actually did. So you end up putting Bootstrap. Oh, I didn't do it. But yeah, so here you'll just want to do, you'll include your Bootstrap here, like with a link. So yeah, just make sure you have your Bootstrap installed. If you want to use the links for they're like CSS classes. You don't have to install the Bootstrap JavaScript for just that. you can just use the CSS just to use like the Bootstrap components for styling purposes. But looking this over, so you'll essentially make a small form. It's a login form, and you'll have like some navigation components like a nav bar, and then have that at the top of the page, login form in the center of the page. So you might want to think about things like, doing a div within a div, using like a container from Bootstrap, and centering that that login form using like the Bootstrap column sizes and things like that. But yeah, so not too crazy. Again, you can do this pretty much with what we just did here. And then also with the code along videos that I have uploaded, and I'll actually push this one to GitHub since it has that Bootstrap class installed on it now. So from there, this will basically be enough to kind of get you guys going towards finishing that first assignment. And then kind of going back through the rest of it. Looking at this, there is no quiz, so that's kind of a nice little fun thing is now we're just working on assignments, and we're going to start moving more and more towards getting this final project ready. So any questions from any of that before we get ready to sign off for the night? All right, and then lastly, like you said, for this, we put some things in the chat. So reactjs.org. Again, if you go to like community and see courses and see other things, if you want to take it a little further, you want to see examples like some of the different types of like you can build out a small React calculator. There's all sorts of fun things like that. And if we go back, like I said, there's the docs, things like that. So I definitely would recommend exploring this page. So let's put that in there. And then, like I said, I had a couple articles, I think, that would give some kind of thoughts to using React and when to use it and things of that nature. All right, so that is it for tonight. And I will kind of keep you guys posted about that backend API that we're going to try to put together. So that way I think we're looking at possibly giving you like a couple different things because I can just change the names of what's in the database and then assign like it, basically its own sort of ID code, kind of like CRUD was doing. So that way, we can, but since I think you guys would be sort of the first class, I could just, whoever wants one, I can just say, okay, Isaiah, this is your API endpoint, and it would be like Isaiah this and that. So shouldn't be too difficult to work out, but I think ultimately, I think it would be helpful. So that way, if you guys are getting hung up on APIs, you could, come back to the source of the API and chat with me about what's being expected, what's supposed to happen. Now, I will tell you this for my Java people, if you want to try one of your Spring Boot APIs out that you built, whether it was one of the code along ones or one of your own ones, I can walk you guys through, we can just schedule a mentor session or do something together. And I can walk you through either the Amazon S3 setup with setting up the endpoints or, in Azure, which all these are free accounts, especially for like test educational environments. You don't have to, you're not going to hit your free limit as far as calls. And then most of them give you like couple $100 in credit to cover you in case for somehow you did hit your limit over those. But I can help get you guys set up on that. And if you wanted to try that out too, so you could have that full, like, full front end, back end, full stack application in your GitHub repository to kind of showcase for job purposes or just for your own, edifice to say, hey, I really did build this whole thing. It's kind of a neat feeling when you build out the API and then you're also, doing the front end portion of it and calling your own API because you understand it better than anybody else. So, all right, that said, any questions? Cool. Again, very entry level React stuff this week. It picks up. The one other thing I kind of thought about in the beginning, thinking about some of the positives of React. If we get into sort of like some of the, when you look at like some of the courses that are coming up, there is the React, Redux, and there's other newer frameworks for React that allow easily to turn a React app into a mobile for Android or iOS. So you can take, your React site and basically make it a mobile app and not just the site itself. So there are some positives in that if you think, I'm not really ever going to build out like full on web apps, but if you thought like it'd be cool to build a mobile app, you can do that through React, and we'll touch a little bit on that later on. And then I'll also give you guys plenty of resources to kind of look at that as well. All right, everyone, have a good night. And then I will be around throughout the week if you guys have any questions or get stuck on anything. Otherwise, we'll see you guys later.
Thank
You
you
think
so
the
much.
Bengals are going to win, Jeff?
Yeah, because Kansas City's coming down from they're going to be coming down from a very high emotional high.
Yep, that was such a good game.
I'm really wanting the Kansas City or not